In this video, we're going to be revising the environmental hazards topic from the National 5 Geography course. This is part of the Global Issues unit, which you'll find in Section 3 of the exam paper. In Section 3, you'll normally be asked to choose 2 from a list of 6 topics, and environmental hazards is normally the third of these 6. A few key points, first of all. As I've already said, this is an optional topic, and your teacher should have made you aware of which of those topics you have been taught in class. The question is normally made up of 2 parts. For Part A, you'll be asked to describe patterns relating to environmental hazards from a map or graph, and this part will normally be worth 4 marks. For Part B, you will be asked to explain the causes of, the effects of, or the responses to a particular environmental hazard, and this will be worth 6 marks. I've grouped the learning outcomes around the 2 parts of the question. For Part A, you will need to be able to describe the pattern of change using a graph that shows information relating to environmental hazards, and be able to do the same thing, describing a pattern from a graph, though this time, that also shows information about environmental hazards. For Part B, you will need to be able to explain the causes of volcanoes, earthquakes, and hurricanes. You'll need to be able to explain the effects of volcanoes and earthquakes and hurricanes. And you will need to be able to explain how people have attempted to reduce the damage caused by volcanoes and earthquakes and hurricanes. So let's have a look at some Part A questions. Here's an example of a graph question. This question says, describe in detail the changes in estimated damage caused by natural disasters from 1990 to 2012. In order to get a mark for this question, you will need to pick 2 years on the graph. You will need to give the amount of damage for each of those 2 years. And you will need to say how much the amount of damage has increased or decreased between those 2 years. For example, in 1990, the amount of damage was $50 million, whereas in 2010, the amount of damage was about $130 million. This is an increase of $80 million. If you find 2 years that have approximately the same figure, it's probably best not to mention them because the question asks you to describe the changes, not the areas where it has stayed the same. Here's an example of a map-based Part A question. This one asks you very simply to describe in detail the distribution of tropical storms. In order to get a mark for this question, you will need to identify the area of the world where the hurricanes or tropical storms originate and the direction in which they then head. For example, some tropical storms originate in the mid-Atlantic Ocean and then travel north and west towards Central America and southeastern USA. Or some tropical storms originate in the Indian Ocean and then travel north towards India and Bangladesh. Now let's have a look at some Part B questions. For Part B, you might be asked to, as was the case in 2019, explain the formation of a tropical storm. You might, as was the case in 2016, be asked to explain the impacts of a volcanic eruption on people and on the natural landscape. Or you might, as was the case in 2018, be asked to explain the strategies that were used to reduce the impact of an earthquake. You do, however, need to be prepared to answer all 3 of these types of question for all 3 hazards. So you need to be able to explain the formation of tropical storms and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. You need to be able to explain the impacts of tropical storms and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, and you need to be able to explain the strategies used to reduce the impacts of all 3 of those hazards. You will also notice that 2 of those 3 questions specify that you need to refer to an example that you have studied in class. The top question doesn't mention that you need to do this, but that doesn't mean that you can't. So let's have a look at what caused the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. Mount St. Helens is on a destructive plate margin. In this particular case, it is where the North American plate meets the Juan de Fuca plate. The Juan de Fuca plate is made of denser oceanic crust, and so it is forced to sink, or subducted, beneath the less dense North American plate, which is made of continental crust. As the oceanic crust sinks, it melts as a result of a combination of friction with the plate above and also heat coming up from the mantle beneath. The melted rock then forces its way back to the surface, where it erupts as a volcano. Mount St. Helens, like most volcanoes at destructive plate margins, tends to erupt fairly infrequently, but more explosively. The lava that erupts out of it, if indeed any lava does erupt out of it, tends to be quite thick and viscous and not run very far from the volcano, which causes it to build up into quite a steep-sided stratovolcano. However, these eruptions can also produce lots of ash, and in the case of this eruption, also pyroclastic flows, instead of, or sometimes as well as, lava flows. In terms of the effect on people, obviously the main impact was that 57 people were killed, mostly by exposure to poisonous gases. 250 homes, nearly 50 bridges, 250 kilometres of roads and 25 kilometres of railways were all destroyed, costing $145 million in repairs. Ash covered crops, preventing photosynthesis and causing the crops to fail, which cost the farming industry around $100 million. Similarly, millions of trees were lost, especially on the slopes of Mount St. Helens itself, which cost the forestry industry $300 million. And mud flows also clogged up the harbour in Portland, Oregon, costing $3 million per month in lost trade. In terms of the effects on the natural landscape, again, the most obvious impact was the fact that 400 metres was lost from the top of Mount St. Helens, having been destroyed in the eruption. Every living thing around the volcano was killed for 25 kilometres north of the mountain itself, including 7,000 animals like elk and bears. Landslides also buried the North Fork of the Toutle River to a depth of up to 200 metres, and in this river, as a result of that, about 12 million salmon were killed. In order to reduce the impacts of the eruption, 2 months before it happened, once an eruption became obvious that it was imminent, resident tourists and forestry workers from around Mount St. Helens were evacuated, and an exclusion zone was set up, although not everybody chose to leave. After the eruption had happened in May of 1980, the Federal Emergency Management Agency did manage to rescue 198 people, although falling ash made using rescue helicopters very difficult. 1 million tonnes of ash were then removed from roads and the surrounding landscape at a cost of $1 million, with around 200,000 people temporarily employed in the clean-up effort. Houses, roads and railways were repaired at a cost of $145 million. Millions of trees were replanted to help rebuild the forestry industry, and farmers and salmon fishers were also given compensation to help rebuild their industry. The Mount St. Helens Visitor Centre was built. This cost $50 million and was designed to bring tourists back into the area. And the National Science Foundation provided $5 million of funding in order to set up 74 separate research projects so that future eruptions could be predicted more accurately. The Tohoku earthquake of 2011 also happened at a destructive plate margin. In this case, the Pacific plate, made of denser oceanic crust, was being subducted beneath an offshoot of the North American plate, made of lighter continental crust. Friction between the two plates caused them to become locked together, and pressure built up until it was suddenly released. The Pacific plate slid up to 40 metres beneath the North American plate, dragging the North American plate with it. When the North American plate snapped back into place, it triggered a tsunami in the ocean above it, which swept out across the Pacific and, of course, most devastatingly, towards the coast of Japan. The important thing with a question about the effects of earthquakes is to make sure that you are clear that we are talking about the earthquake, not the effects of the tsunami, because the obvious effects of the earthquake was that it caused a tsunami, which swept in across the Japanese landscape up to 10 kilometers inland, along 2,000 of kilometers of coast, leaving up to 25 million tons of rubble in its wake. The earthquake was so powerful that Japan's coastline sunk by 1 meter and the seabed rose by 3 meters, making Japan vulnerable to future tsunamis. In terms of the effects on people, obviously the main impact was that the earthquake triggered a tsunami. The tsunami killed nearly 16,000 people, and an additional 4,000 are still officially missing. Nearly 46,000 buildings were destroyed, and some 144,000 were damaged. Over 4 million homes were left without power, and 1.5 million homes were left without water as a result of damage to infrastructure. 230,000 vehicles were either damaged or destroyed, and 319 fishing ports were damaged, causing knock-on effects to the Japanese fishing industry. Finally, 19 nuclear reactors had to be closed down and 200,000 people evacuated, most famously, of course, at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, where the cleanup operation is still ongoing to this day, nearly 10 years later. In terms of the responses to the earthquake, before the earthquake, sea walls had been built up to 10 meters high to prevent tsunamis from sweeping inland. However, as I've said, changes to the coastline and seabed meant that the 10-meter tsunami was actually able to come over the top of a 10-meter sea wall. There was also, in 2008, a tsunami drill for 18,000 people held in the region so that people would know what to do in the event of a tsunami. In the short term after the tsunami had happened, all bullet trains were stopped automatically within 2 seconds of the earthquake being detected. Automatic warnings were spread across the country within just over 30 seconds of the earthquake, and the Japanese Self-Defense Force had already identified communities that had been completely cut off within half an hour of the earthquake happening. In the slightly longer term, China donated $4.5 million worth of aid, like tents and blankets, to help people who had been displaced from their homes as a result of the tsunami. There was a concert organised by Jackie Chan, which raised over $3 million. And 96% of electricity and 98% of the water supply that was cut off as a result of the tsunami had been restored within 6 months. In the much longer term, Japan's new growth strategy was intended to provide £190 billion over 10 years to help rebuild Japan's economy and restart trade with other countries. Hurricane Katrina formed off the Bahamas in August 2005. Here, sea temperatures were 27 degrees, down to a depth of at least 60 meters. And this was the main source of Hurricane Katrina's energy. The warm seawaters caused the air above them to become heated themselves. And this warm air, being less dense than cooler air around it, started to rise. As this air rose, it drew in more warm, moisture-carrying air from the surface below it. And as this air carried on rising, it started to rotate due to the Coriolis effect, reaching speeds of up to 60 kilometers per hour at the eye wall, just outside the center of the storm. This eye wall is the point where the strongest winds and heaviest rain were encountered within Hurricane Katrina. As it then moved towards the southern states of the USA, it passed over the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf of Mexico, gaining in energy and strengthening until by the time it made landfall, it was a Category 5 hurricane. In terms of the impacts that this had on people and on the natural landscape. Most obviously, over 1,500 people were killed by the hurricane in Louisiana alone, mostly as a result of flooding that resulted from the storm surge. Over 800,000 people had to be rescued, whether that was from rooftops by helicopters or by boat. Buildings, roads and bridges were destroyed, and over 1 million people were made homeless. Power lines were brought down, leaving nearly 1 million people without power, and hundreds of thousands of people were made unemployed. In particular, the oil industry in the Gulf of Mexico was badly affected, with 30 offshore oil platforms damaged and 9 refineries having to be shut down for 6 months, reducing production by 25%. Overall, the total cost of Hurricane Katrina to the state of Louisiana alone was $22 billion. As I've said, the main impact of Hurricane Katrina on the natural landscape was a 7-metre-high storm surge which swept inland along low-lying parts of the coast. Some 80% of New Orleans was flooded under 6 metres of water, partly as a result of the collapse of levees along the sides of the river Mississippi. Huge areas of farmland were also completely destroyed, making it very difficult to grow crops for some years into the future as a result of the salt that had been brought inland from the sea, which makes it very difficult to grow crops. Before the hurricane hit the southern states of the USA, there had been, as there is indeed in every year, a National Hurricane Preparedness Week so that people would know what to do in the event of a hurricane. With Hurricane Katrina specifically, the National Hurricane Center had accurately predicted both the path and the speed that the hurricane would take, and 90% of New Orleans had been successfully evacuated before it hit. After the hurricane, the US National Guard sent 58,000 troops from across all 50 US states to help maintain law and order, as well as to help with the search and rescue efforts. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, also provided rental assistance or trailers for over 700,000 of the people who had been made homeless. The US government, in addition, provided $110 billion to help rebuild the city and the wider states that had been affected by Hurricane Katrina. Canada, Mexico, and the UK all sent rescue workers and equipment to help look for people who were missing after the hurricane. Slovenia sent $120,000 worth of tents, blankets, and first aid kits. And India sent 25 tons of food and water and medicine, all to help look after people who had been made homeless or injured in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So this concludes the revision video for the environmental hazards topic of the National 5 Geography course. Thank you for listening.